Hello everybody, and today we're going to have a brief look at the state of the Spanish Navy, and yes, it was still called the Spanish Armada, in 1898 at the eve of the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. Now, when the said war broke out, one of the first things that the US Navy had to figure out was just exactly what force it would be fighting. Although the Americans had kept abreast of developments in various navies that might pose a threat to US interests, and the Spanish Caribbean holdings, if nothing else, were uncomfortably close to the US coastline, the massive changes in naval technology in the past few decades meant that any evaluation might be obsolete even before it had been fully compiled. For example, there is a naval report prepared for the US Navy in 1896. But when you compare what it lists, including ships under construction, compared to what was the case 2 years later on, there are some rather glaring deficiencies. But anyway, for much of the period between the end of the American Civil War and the 1890s, it had actually been the Armada that was very much in the ascendancy. The US Navy had entered the 1870s with the bulk of their massive Civil War-era fleet unceremoniously scrapped, and most of the pre-war fleet had either been burnt, sunk, or was battle-damaged and or badly worn out. By contrast, the Spanish, who hadn't faced a major naval conflict since they'd ended up on the wrong side of the Napoleonic Wars almost a century earlier, had accumulated a fairly substantial force of large frigates and last-generation ships of the line, along with just over half a dozen modern ironclads ranging in size from a floating battery of under 1,000 tons through a number of small frigates and indeed a monitor type, as well as conversions of wooden capital ships, all the way up to a couple of fairly serious second-generation ocean-going capital ships. Indeed, during the Virginius affair of the 1870s, which was also connected with tensions in Cuba, the US media's demand for war had been somewhat tempered by the government's realization that sitting in a major US port undergoing maintenance at the time was the Spanish ironclad Arapile, which was not even the most powerful ship in the Spanish arsenal at the time, but there was literally nothing available in the US Navy arsenal at the time that could actually have dealt with it had the media got their way and war been declared at that time. This meant that any battle outside of the immediate US coastline in this period would have been heavily biased in favour of a Spanish task force. But by the 1890s, things had swung about quite massively. Firstly, much of the older Spanish ironclad force had become obsolete. Broadside and central battery ironclads were yesterday's news. The barbette ironclad and the all-steel battleship, what we would nowadays call an early pre-dreadnought, were the real arbiters of naval power now, alongside the emerging fleets of protected and armoured cruisers, and the relatively new torpedo boat, torpedo gunboat, and torpedo boat destroyer classes that were also entering service with most major navies. Thus, in a span of not much more than 15 years, the existing Spanish fleet had gone from being easily capable of dealing with the US Navy to suffering the same block obsolescence issues that the increasingly geriatric fleet of American Civil War-era monitors had gone through some time earlier. But it wasn't just technology that had changed. Economically and politically, the landscape had changed quite considerably as well. The advent of a number of small regional navies purchasing modern warships alongside the Virginius incident had acted as something of a wake-up call to the US Navy and Congress. When confronted with reports, such as one that stated that, of all people, the Brazilian Navy was now entirely capable of rolling up any US Navy task force if they so chose, a huge push to expand and modernize the US Navy was begun. But like almost every other such attempt until World War II, Congress was fully in favour of enhancing US power in this way, right up until they'd been given the potential bill, at which point the proposal was quietly taken round the back of the building and beaten with sticks until it had stopped twitching. However, one of the advantages of aiming high, and the USN had aimed to go from basically 0 to almost Royal Navy size in the matter of a decade, was that with almost everything else cut away, even a small percentage of what was left of the procurement bill was actually still a reasonable amount for what at this point was still a regional navy. The US Navy, now, at the end of the 1890s, possessed a number of battleships, albeit that the first one, USS Maine, which would end up being the catalyst of the Spanish-American War, was rather quickly demoted to armoured cruiser status. This was followed by a small fleet that consisted of a pair of one-offs and a class of 3. First, the USS Texas, then the 3-strong Indiana class, and then the USS Iowa. No, not that one. Of these, only the Iowa could truly be described as fully ocean-going, but all of them were still relatively powerful ships for the time. 5 more vessels were in various stages of construction as of 1898, which would of course double the US Navy's order of battle in short order, at least as far as capital ships were concerned. There are also half a dozen supposedly sea-capable monitors and another half-dozen coastal-only vessels still in service, but these were so old and so slow that they only really mattered in an invasion scenario or perhaps a blockade of very slow merchantmen. But the US Navy did also possess 2 modern armoured cruisers, the Brooklyn and the New York, along with over a dozen protected cruisers that ranged from excellent, such as USS Olympia, through to ships like the Cincinnati and Montgomery classes, which were really more suited to worrying merchant ships as opposed to warships. Although it should be noted that a number of US Navy cruisers of this period were very heavily armed for their displacement, with a typical displacement of between 3,000 and 6,000 tons, seeing 8-inch guns as not being an uncommon sight on the protected cruisers. This was supplemented by a small fleet of gunboats, around half a dozen torpedo boats, a single submarine, the Holland, and a small collection of miscellaneous ships including the dynamite cruiser Vesuvius, a torpedo ram, some training ships, a few patrol vessels, and, when it came to wartime, a number of merchant liners, merchantmen, and yachts that were converted to varying degrees of usefulness in military purposes as scouts, auxiliary cruisers, and the like. Comparatively, Spain had lost a significant portion of its overseas empire in the early 1800s, courtesy of Simón Bolívar, but the resurgence of Spain in the 1870s had owed much to the tragically short-lived Alfonso XII. And now, Spain held only a few islands in the Caribbean, chief amongst them Cuba, plus the Philippines, various assorted small Pacific islands, and a few random bits of Africa, because, after all, you couldn't be a proper European colonial empire in the 19th century without owning at least some African soil. Due to both a falling economy and somewhat understandable political turmoil after the king's death, Spain had sold some of its Pacific holdings to the up-and-coming German Empire, and was thus having to split the Armada between Cuba, Spain, and the Philippines. Whilst the destruction of the Maine removed the US Navy's likely least useful capital ship from the equation, it didn't materially affect the balance of power in naval terms. The Armada's capital ships at this point numbered 3, at least in theory, but really only 1 in practice. The Numancia and the Vittoria were certainly large, both topping 7,000 tons, but they were also broadside ironclads from the first generation that had succeeded HMS Warrior. And whilst they could still probably comfortably deal with a US Navy gunboat or any of the older monitors that happened to show up, in practical terms they weren't really worth the crews that manned them, as even compared to the smallest US Navy capital ship, the USS Texas, they really weren't worth all that much. However, the one ace in the hole that the Spanish did have in this category was the battleship Pelayo. Whilst not exactly a world-leading design, she was still a solid enough ship that, at least on paper, she could comfortably deal one-on-one with practically anything the US Navy could throw at her, in large part thanks to her being actually fully ocean-capable, something that everything apart from USS Iowa in the US Navy's capital ship department really wasn't. Albeit, of course, she was heavily outnumbered in this category if she should go into coastal waters such as, the Caribbean. In armoured cruisers, however, there seemed to be some salvation. The Armada had 5, as opposed to the US Navy's 2, with 3 more building, and most of these were very heavily armed, with 11-inch guns as their main battery. Unfortunately, this on-paper strength, which might seem at first to even possibly counter some of the American battleships, was undermined by every vessel having one significant problem or another. The Infanta Maria Teresa, Vizcaya, and Almirante Oquendo seemed to be almost second-class battleships on paper with second-class battleship-thick belts, until you realised that that main armour belt, which was up to 12 inches thick, was so narrow that it would actually be something of a surprising feat to actually hit it with an incoming shell, instead of, the rest of the hull. Emperador Carlos V had a wider spread, but really only fuse-initiating 2-inch belt, and Cristobal Colon, originally an Italian Giuseppe Garibaldi-class vessel, which, as designed, had an excellent balance of speed, protection, and firepower, had been delivered with only its secondary 6-inch battery after her main 10-inch battery had been rejected by the Spanish Admiralty. In the smaller cruisers, again, in theory, the Armada might find itself at something of an advantage, with a slightly larger number than the US Navy. But once more, a deep look shows a significant number of issues. In theory, there were 5 protected and 10 unprotected cruisers available, the Spanish having managed to lose 3 cruisers in the past decade to wrecks and storms. But that latter designation of unprotected cruiser was not as much of a problem as it might at first seem, since a number of US cruisers might as well have fallen into that category as well. But of the protected cruisers, the 3 Isla de Luzon class were really actually barely a step above gunboats, and the 2 remaining Reina Regente class, the Alfonso XIII and Lepanto, were not quite finished yet, albeit that they could be made serviceable in a pinch. Now, of the unprotected ships, Castilla, the 3 Alfonso XII class, and the 6 Velasco class, well, they were all a bit small and carried fairly weak armament, a handful of guns of around 6-inch caliber, give or take a little bit depending on the class, and slightly more and/or a few 4.7-inch guns, again depending on the class. They were also generally quite slow. Now, granted, as mentioned previously, some of the US cruisers weren't exactly large, fast, or really protected either, but even at this lower end of the scale, the Cincinnati and Montgomery classes did at least carry significantly more guns in this size range than many of the Spanish vessels. Now, when it came to small craft, the destroyers, torpedo gunboats and the like, the Armada did in fact have a definite advantage, with a dozen torpedo gunboats, which were the precursor to destroyers, and so designed to hunt torpedo craft either in service or about to enter service, against the US Navy's half-dozen-ish or so torpedo boats. In addition, 21 actual destroyers of varying ages were in service. These gave the Armada a huge margin of superiority when it came to small craft, and actually left the US Navy quite vulnerable to a torpedo strike if sufficient vessels could be concentrated and an attack launched in optimal conditions, i.e. basically night or other low-visibility weather. But the majority of these vessels were based in Spain, with only a few scattered across the Caribbean and Philippine naval operational areas, and even then, they weren't concentrated all in one place, as these small torpedo boats and destroyers were considered to be excellent ships to use economically to guard minor, far-flung areas such as Puerto Rico. Matching the Americans, the Spanish also had a single submarine, although it was about as much use in a prolonged overseas war as the Holland was, along with around 3 dozen gunboats of varying descriptions, many of these actually being present in the colonial fleets. Now, with all that said and done, you might imagine the Armada stood no chance whatsoever, especially if you know how the Spanish-American War actually turned out. But it wasn't quite as clear-cut as that at the beginning. Whilst there were a number of significant other issues in the Armada, including poor maintenance, shortages of gunpowder, gunnery practice, and indeed shortages of actual working live ammunition, all of which would return to plague the Spanish squadrons during the conflict, There were some factors that were in favour of the Spanish, as whilst the US Navy now enjoyed overall superiority, the majority of the ships that granted them that capacity were not especially, or in some cases at all, suited for long overseas deployments. So whilst attacking the continental United States was out of the question, and it was relatively likely that holding Cuba would not have been possible, at least from a naval perspective, the Philippines were another matter entirely. The US actually had a relatively small squadron in the area, and whilst its flagship, the Olympia, was very powerful for its size, the Spanish, in theory, could have deployed a vastly stronger force, mostly from Spain, to defend the area, including armoured cruisers and the Pelayo, as the same restrictions that confined much of the US Navy's strength to their side of the ocean precluded much of any assault on Spain itself. Not that that prevented the Spanish government and press from panicking about it. However, in this respect, the escalation to war was very much a surprise for the Spanish, and thus the US Navy found itself with some time to prepare and get on a war footing, whereas the Armada was caught somewhat more flat-footed and thus scrambling for a response. And so it was that many of the Armada's newer and more powerful units saw most of the war sitting home in the one operational theatre that saw no conflict, Spanish home waters. Being close to home also meant that their ammunition and supply issues, which really did plague the colonial fleets, were not quite as bad for them, and so the abortive attempt by a squadron led by Pelayo to relieve the Philippines may well have been very successful had it been launched earlier, albeit obviously that this would require more notice to Spain of the war, and thus a chance to prepare the ships for deployment. So with all that said and done, was there really anything that the Armada could have done to not necessarily win the Spanish-American War, but at least to have salvaged something from it? Well, hindsight is obviously a wonderful thing, and in pure hindsight terms, if you're acting completely from a military perspective, yes, there's plenty they could have done. However, it also has to be acknowledged that war is a political creation as well, and there's certainly a fair amount of suggestion that the Spanish authorities knew that they couldn't win the war in the long run, and so they just wanted to get it over and done with as quickly as possible, even if that meant throwing away significant portions of the Spanish fleet in a kind of, well, we tried and there was a heroic last stand, and so now we can't do anything, so we might as well give up kind of attitude. But politics can, of course, change. So, was there anything they could have really done to hold Cuba or to win the Battle of Santiago de Cuba? No, not really. As we've covered, the Spanish fleet just did not have the numbers, the technology, or the ships to stand up to the US Navy of 1898-1899 in what was effectively their home waters. Could they have held on to Puerto Rico? Again, no. They had an unprotected cruiser and a destroyer there. But the interesting thing is, the fleet that ultimately faced off against the US Navy at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba was not there when the war broke out. The Caribbean was not particularly well staffed by Spanish warships. The Spanish government chose to send several sets of reinforcements, including the armoured cruisers that would inevitably be the ones that got victimised in that battle. So, if they had instead decided perhaps the best way of getting the war done and over with would be to effectively leave Cuba to the Americans, which, let's face it, of the two, Cuba was the much preferred target rather than the Philippines, although America ended up notionally either in charge of or in a dominant position over both of them. What they could have done instead was to, as I said, leave Cuba there, and if they'd sent that reinforcing squadron plus not drained the Philippines of some ships, and instead sent those 4 armoured cruisers to the Philippines, now that could have been very interesting, because whilst it would almost have shades of the 2nd Pacific Squadron a few years down the line, the Spanish ships could have used that journey time to brush up on their gunnery skills, check on their supplies, etc., And when they then arrive in Manila Bay, granted the Spanish forces in Manila Bay were not exactly top of the line, as the USS Olympia and her contingent would later prove, but if you then drop in 4 armoured cruisers plus escorts into that mix, that changes things quite considerably. All of a sudden, whilst Olympia is arguably a match for any of them, given the various states that they were in and the questionable nature of a lot of their design, as we outlined previously, there are still 4. And there's only one of Olympia, and everything else is lesser than that. So if the Spanish had concentrated their overseas naval forces in the Philippines, then, well, that's not going to change the fate of Cuba all that much, but it would mean that the Americans would have a very difficult choice. Either they just have to stand there and watch the Spanish keep the Philippines, at which point Spain will come out of the war somewhat better off than they did historically, or the US Navy sails in to attack the Spanish anyway, and there's a reasonable chance they lose that engagement. Of course, it could go the other way. It could well be that the journey from Spain to the Philippines might tax the Spanish armoured cruisers so much they might be in just as broken down and clapped out condition as the Spanish ships that were already there historically. So you never know, it might be an even greater victory, and we might be singing Olympia's praises even more than we already do. But if the Spanish do manage to pull a win out there and destroy, cripple, or capture the US Asiatic Squadron, then that leaves everything in a bit of an interesting conundrum, because most of the heavy US overseas units, or, well, for a given notion of heavy, have been destroyed. They could send Brooklyn and New York, the 2 armoured cruisers, around. I really, really wouldn't want to bet on sending any of the battleships round all the way across the Pacific, but they could send Brooklyn and New York. And I think it's arguable to say that certainly by the time they'd actually arrive, with presumably a few more escorts as well, there's a reasonable chance that Brooklyn and New York might be able to deal with what's left of the Spanish fleet. However, that would take an awful long time, because remember, at this point, the Panama Canal doesn't exist. So the 2 ships would have to go back to an East Coast port. They'd have to restock, refuel, probably refit after all the operations off Cuba. So let's say that takes a month. It's then going to take about a month to a month and a half for them to get around South America to, say, San Diego to replenish stocks and supplies again. Then they've got to head all the way across the Pacific, and finally they'll wind up in Manila probably a quarter of a year after the call for them to actually go there. A quarter of a year of quote-unquote war where nothing much happens other than, well, we'll get there eventually, probably not going to go down too well, and the numerical issues, unless Olympia pulls off something absolutely magical and wipes out half of the Spanish squadron in going down, is not really, the odds aren't really going to look very attractive. So if the Spanish had decided to concentrate the Armada in the Philippines, and that still allows them to keep an armoured cruiser and the Pelayo back in Spain, just in case, then it's conceivable the Spanish might have been able to hold on to the Philippines with a victory over the US Asiatic Squadron. Now, if that happens, the peace treaty that's negotiated is going to be a lot more delicate. The Spanish still want out of the war, so they're probably not going to press for too much extra. But it then does have rather interesting knock-on effects, because if Spain keeps the Philippines, at least for the minute, then what happens then in World War II? I mean, in World War I, Japan was friendly to the Western powers, so it doesn't make much odds there. But come World War II, if the Philippines is either still Spanish or has gained its independence, the US doesn't actually have any other major interests in the Western Pacific. Now, maybe they've managed to take Guam off the Spanish as they did historically in this particular war. Maybe not, but Guam is not really going to be very high up the Imperial Japanese Navy's hit list. If the Philippines are independent or Spanish, it makes it very easy for the Japanese to roll over them, but it also means there's not really any cause for war for the United States in particular in that region. And without a direct problem for the Japanese Navy of an American-controlled Philippines standing in their way, it also renders it questionable as to whether or not the Japanese would go for Pearl Harbor. Because after all, Pearl Harbor was predicted on and executed on the fact that the Japanese would have to take the Philippines. The Philippines were owned by the Americans. If they provoke the Americans have to come after them. Therefore, the best strategy is to hit them first. Now, granted, there'd still be a lot of economic concerns and possibly the blockade and, well, not blockade, but embargo of goods like oil that the United States might impose on them, and that might well eventually spark some kind of conflict. But without a Pearl Harbor, because the Japanese would reason that there's not really any particular American cause for war if the Philippines don't belong to them, then what else are the Japanese going to do? Well, they'll roll over the Philippines. Well, that's too bad for either the independent Philippines or the Spanish. They keep going. They hit the various colonial powers. That serves the American interest to weaken both Japan and the colonial powers in the inevitable battles. So as and when America gets involved in the war, and whether or not they're quite as determined to break Japan as they were historically, it could potentially throw off the whole course of World War II, one way or the other. So yeah, there's an interesting counterfactual for you. Just by sailing east instead of west, the Spanish Armada of 1898 might well have had a very long-term effect on the outcome of the Second World War. But with all that said and done, I hope you've enjoyed this video, having a quick look at the state of the Spanish Armada in 1898, and perhaps gives you a little bit more of an idea of what went down and why it went down in the Spanish-American War, which are battles that we will look at in more detail in future videos. And hope to see you again in another video at some point.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.